The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Superintendent of Financial Institutions released his annual risk outlook yesterday. It's now a warning from their own regulator for this Liberal-NDP government to heed. Canadian homeowners who renew their mortgages over the next 2 years could face a payment shock. A payment shock. The root cause of this spike in payments is this government's loose spending policies. Large deficits have driven inflation, which have increased mortgage costs. With all these warnings, will the Minister of Finance take a lesson and reverse her inflationary spending policies?
Hear, hear. Well, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, let's take note, the Parliamentary Budget Officer just this week described Canada's fiscal position as top of class. And so did the International Monetary Fund when describing Canada's growth in 2025. We're also, I remind the Conservatives, rated #1 in the world with a AAA credit rating, which has been reaffirmed by independent credit agencies. And when it comes to combating inflation, the Governor of the Bank of Canada says we're on the right track. So let me ask the Conservatives this. Does the Conservative leader intend to fire all the independent experts in the world that disagree with his doomsday narrative?
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, that's avoiding every touch point he doesn't want to pay attention to, including from his own regulator. Let's look at the follow-on risks that OSFI identified. Stress in the mortgage insurance industry, investment portfolio risk, asset management risk, insurance risk, all rising. This house of cards does not end well. It's obvious to the regulator and to all Canadians that after 9 years of failed economic policies, this government is just not worth the cost. Can we see a redo on last month's disastrous budget that will bring back the fiscal balance Canadians desperately need?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Minister of Housing and Infrastructure.
At any point in time, a democracy is bound to face risk, particularly in a difficult economic environment that we face domestically and internationally, Mr. Speaker. But what I would say to the member, to echo my colleague who just spoke on this side, a AAA credit rating, affirmed recently by Moody's, who said that we have the best fiscal record in the G7, the lowest debt and deficit in the G7. Those are foundation points, Mr. Speaker, that will carry us through difficult times. And it is a hard time for Canadians. He talks about those Canadians who want to renew their mortgage. Where were they over the years? We wanted to support them. They were never there.
The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
In 2020, the Prime Minister's own bank governor said interest rates are very low and they're going to be low for a long time. This week, OSFI reported that mortgage holders will face a payment shock because of high interest rates. They said the shock will be the worst for those who took low mortgage rates in 2020. Words matter. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister misleading Canadians, will he finally admit he's not worth the cost to homeowners?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it was great to have the independent Governor of the Bank of Canada attend the Finance Committee recently. And let me quote him in saying, when he was at committee, he said, and I quote, "The budget does respect the fiscal guardrails that the government put in place, and that keeping the net debt to GDP ratio on a declining track, and importantly, keeping deficits below 1% of GDP in future years. The budget also commits to those guardrails going forward, and that is helpful." That's exactly the words of the independent Bank of Canada governor. I wonder if this is why the Conservative leader wants to fire the independent.
The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Also in 2020, the Prime Minister said interest rates are at historic lows, Glenn. Millions of people took out low-interest mortgages. Tuesday, his own bank regulators reported that homeowners renewing mortgages will now face a payment shock because of high mortgage rates they got in 2020, increasing the risk of default. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister misleading Canadians, will he finally admit he is not worth the cost to people who are losing their homes?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is proud of having one of the most stable and flexible financial institutions and financial markets in the world. Right. It is also true that Canada's fiscal position is a particularly strong one. What would put that all at risk, Mr. Speaker? the Banana Republic promise of the Leader of the Opposition to fire the Governor of the Bank of Canada, sending shockwaves to global markets and exposing homeowners, mortgage holders, to intense interest rate risk.